Hi.
Hi, Hannah. How are you doing today?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing good. I am excited for this episode, and I want to start out with a couple disclaimers.
Oh, okay.
One, we are doing this episode with the podcast-a-thon. I'll add some information on that at the end about how you can go and find out about other podcasts that are recording this week. I'll be including a link to support Partners in Health, which is a health organization that promotes building and maintenance of health systems in countries where they have been
Neglected for various structural reasons.
Yes. And then also the caveat that since I am going to be primarily leading this episode, there's going to be a lot of like weird stitching going throughout because I'm such...
Sam said to me one time last week that made me laugh. I said, do I talk so much more than you do when we're podcasting? And you said, well, it starts out as more like 60-40, but then the ratio shifts after I edit out all of my ums and uhs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So enough about us. Mm-hmm. Today we are talking about the book Everything is Tuberculosis by John Green.
My parents' dog, Sylvie, thought that this book was delicious. Yeah.
It is a delicious book. If you're a dog, it's delicious to your taste buds.
Yeah.
And if you're a human, it's delicious to
your brain.
It's delicious in a way that is both thought-provoking and at times enraging.
Yes. I got very frustrated reading this book. It had more for a literary and sociological mind than I would have expected.
The premise of the book, basically, as the title would imply, it's about the disease tuberculosis, which you may or may not have heard of, especially if you are living in the US or other Western countries or globally North countries, however you want to frame it. But typically not a disease that we think of super often. I mean, I think we all have heard of it, but I don't know many people who know people who have had tuberculosis. To the extent that someone may have heard of it in a Western country, it would probably be someone who has had HIV and had a compromised immune system.
Or it was somebody who is a fan of opera and like stories that take place in historical periods where consumption was a big deal. And in that case, they might not even realize, as I didn't before I read this book, that consumption was tuberculosis.
Yes. And John Green goes on throughout the book much about the mythology of consumption, aka tuberculosis, and how our perspective as a Western population has shifted over time.
And how the mythologizing of tuberculosis has been gendered and racialized.
Yeah.
There is like one story in the book that is a through line, and it is the story of, what is the kid's name? Henry.
Henry is both John Green's first son's name and also the name of this person.
When John met him, Henry was a kid. Although an older kid than John realized. He's like a teenager. He's 15 or 16.
I think he's like closer to 17 or 18 when John...
No, yeah, really? Okay.
Because John Green thought that...
He was like 8 or 9.
Yeah. He thought that the Henry that he was meeting and his son Henry were about the same age, when in fact they were almost 10 years apart.
Yes.
And this was mostly due to the fact that the Henry that he met was actively diagnosed with tuberculosis and was suffering from that. And that can make people, especially at that age, appear much younger than they actually are. But Henry Ryder is his name. Henry Ryder's story is very much a through line through the book. But outside of that, each chapter is kind of its own like historical short story about tuberculosis and how our perspective on it was shaped by thinking of the time and how it has changed since then. It's not really a book that has a clean summary. And like you said, I think Henry Ryder's story is something that if you have not read the book would be something that you should go and read it, because it is a compelling story So the premise of Everything is Tuberculosis is that tuberculosis is not a disease caused by a bacteria, but by humans and human choices. That is the central argument, the central theme throughout this book. And this obviously is going to come as kind of a, wait, what? It's going to cause people pause because we're so accustomed to thinking of disease as a biomedical phenomenon, something based in science. Humans don't cause infections. Bacteria are the cause of infections.
Or like microorganisms.
Yeah, there's a science to this. Like, you can't just ignore the science is kind of a perspective that I think many people would have in response to this.
It's so funny that, like, when humanities and social science people try to point out social construction, that a common, like, knee-jerk response is, well, you're ignoring the science, as if those two things are mutually exclusive.
Yes. And so I think the thought with any disease, with any especially like infectious disease, is that if we can understand what's happening at a cellular level with the microorganism and our body, then we can cure the disease. We can fight it. We can get rid of it.
Mm-hmm.
And yet we have for over 100 years now known about the microorganism, the bacteria, Mycobacterium tuberculosis, that is the cause of tuberculosis. And for over 50 years, we've had a treatment for it.
A cure, right?
Yeah, a treatment and a cure for this infection. And yet, in 2024, 1.23 million people died from tuberculosis, and 10.7 million people had tuberculosis. And obviously, this is not something that is equally distributed. This is something that is going to affect those nations like the global south more so than those of the global north, or what you would hear considered like developed versus developing countries.
And also, the individual people who are most vulnerable to this disease are younger and older.
Yes. And yeah, this kind of defies the logic of modern science. We know how to treat it. We know how to stop it. And yet it's one of the like 10 leading causes of death in the world. So like what's going on here? The entirety of the book kind of follows that through line. What were some points in the book that you found compelling, or what were some of the thoughts that you had after you finished this book?
I think maybe I was less surprised than you were by what you just articulated, because I'm pretty accustomed to understanding the world and specifically understanding health in terms of political and social systems. And so it didn't feel revelatory to me, or I should say it didn't feel surprising to me, because revelatory has a positive connotation, that a disease that we understand and know how to cure and prevent is a leading cause of death. And so like the aspects of the book that I gravitated toward were more how we mythologize and imagine around this bacterium, and like how our abstract associations and literary associations with it change depending on whether the body that it's affecting is a masculine or feminine body, and whether the body that it's affecting is a white or racialized body. But in terms of the point that you just articulated, I would say my biggest reaction was one of frustration.
Yeah.
But not surprise.
Yeah. And before we go further, because what I really want to get into is more of our thoughts about the book rather than what the book has to say itself, because I think, again, the book kind of stands for itself in what it's saying. Everything I just discussed gives you an idea of what the book is. If that sounds interesting to you, you should read it. And also, like, even if it sounds slightly interesting to you, you should read it.
Yeah, because it's written in a very accessible and engaging way. It's not a rough read.
No, not like science heavy. This is John Green. If you didn't know, he's the guy who wrote The Fault in Our Stars, An Abundance of Catherines.
As a seasoned YA novelist, he knows how to make a book accessible.
Yes, and also thread a narrative. But here are some quotes from the book that I think would be a good reinforcement of what we just said. We cannot address tuberculosis only with vaccines and medications. We cannot address it only with comprehensive STP programs. We must also address the root cause of tuberculosis, which is injustice. In a world where everyone can eat and access healthcare, and be treated humanely, tuberculosis has no chance. Ultimately, we are the cause. Here's another quote. Honestly, I think this one was the best quote that I came across. People who are treated as less than fully human by the social order are more susceptible to tuberculosis, but it's not because of their moral codes or choices or genetics. It's because they are treated as less than fully human by the social order.
Mm-hmm.
That, I think, really is where the insight and also the frustrating, enraging part of the book comes from. It's this idea that, like, because we in the global north are separated from this disease and we don't see it often, it's not a big deal. I think after finishing the book, if I had to retitle it, I would call it Everything is Capitalism. And that sounds very cliche to me, and it sounds kind of like a clickbaity title. I think it's good that John Green's book probably was not called Everything is Capitalism. But what I'm hearing in John Green's voice is this yearning for a world where everyone is treated in a way that he was most likely treated. Because John Green and myself, both as white men in America, are beneficiaries of a capitalist system. Like, everything that we have accomplished, everything that we have to be, not everything, but, a lot that we have to be grateful for, our quality of life, is all thanks to the fact that we have been valued over and above many other people in the world. And so what I hear in John Green's voice is maybe something that I can associate with, which is this yearning for a better world, despite the world you grew up in
working for you.
Yeah.
Well, and he brings in specific anecdotes from his interfacing with the healthcare system.
Yeah.
And I think we should, maybe an additional disclaimer is not everyone living in the US does have health coverage.
Right. So I grew up with this perspective that kind of centered capitalism, and it didn't center capitalism in a sense that, like, I would have said it centered capitalism growing up. I think it's interesting that, like, capitalism, I feel like, is a word or concept that is used more maybe by the left. But I think, like, the word capitalism, the idea of capitalism, really came to prominence from Marx and his writings on capital, rather than, like, something that the proponents of, like, the Industrial Revolution thought of as I don't think they thought of themselves as capitalists. I think they were
proponents of natural law and natural hierarchies and natural competition.
Right.
Whereas, like, Marx, in writing about capitalism, was pointing at a constructed injustice, something that he didn't perceive to be an extension of natural law. And I think on the left, we talk about capitalism a lot because we don't understand it to be just the way things are.
Right.
Whereas I think on the right, capitalism is seen as a moral good because competition and hierarchy are seen as the natural order of humanity and the natural world.
Right. So that was the perspective I grew up with, was this natural state of human affairs and the world being a result of that, not a result of
systems that have been constructed.
Exactly.
To uphold artificial hierarchies.
So while I had a capitalist perspective growing up, I wouldn't have called it that.
No.
And so what I think both this book is trying to do or does, and what I am in the process of myself trying to accomplish, I think my perspective has definitely shifted beyond a capitalist framework. But shifting from, like, this capitalist perspective into, I'm going to call it a relational or health perspective, or, if you are a diehard leftist, you probably would say, like, a communist perspective or a socialist perspective.
I think the leftist response there would be, you were never a capitalist, because the true capitalists are those that own the means of production.
Yes, but I was a proponent of capitalism in the sense that I reinforced its perspective unknowingly, and I know I have shifted away from that. I don't quite know what I've shifted towards, and I think that's maybe also where John Green is at. I think some of the critiques of the book is that John Green didn't lean into, like, some of the more critical discussions of capitalism and the way that it
Kills people.
kills people and inherently as a system creates these systemic injustices.
Yeah, creates a system where some will die inevitably.
Right, for the benefit of the
people who won't die.
Yes. I think what the book is trying to get at, for me, someone like a reader like me, to see that like this framework of capitalism, whether or not we realize that's what we are holding, this idea that like tuberculosis is a disease we haven't solved because of market inefficiencies, is wrong. And what we need to shift to is a more relational understanding of all this and say that it's not a matter of money. You know, we're building AI data centers all over the country. There's money, especially in the world we live in today. I mean, the promise of the internet was to connect the world, and in a lot of ways it has. But if we continue to use it to prop up the voices of this like techno progress endpoint of humanity, where technology is going to save us all, we have all the solutions. We just have to let the smart people keep inventing our way towards a better future. We're going to continue to leave people behind, and we're going to continue to let people die.
We have the resources, but the people who own those resources don't have the will.
Right.
Because the system in place incentivizes consumption and profit for shareholders. And that's evil.
Yeah. To go back to that quote, it's, you know, people who are treated as less than fully human by the social order. It creates these perspectives where we then mythologize that these people were somehow morally deficient.
Right. Well, because if we're invested in believing that ultimately the best way to end suffering and inequality in the world is to just keep on relentlessly pursuing scientific and technological progress and discovery, and yet we see that in reality, people keep on dying, then we have to make up a secondary story in order to prop up the first. And that is that the people who are dying must be inferior in some way, morally, intellectually, genetically. Yeah. And that's where stigma comes in.
Yeah. And, you know, I made an interesting point earlier, which I think we kind of disagreed on, which is that, like, if you ask the average American whether they think their life is worth more than that of someone who lives in Sierra Leone, I said, I think most people, at least if you know, out loud, would probably say, no, you know, we're all humans. And yet the state of the world doesn't reflect that seemingly
obvious and agreed upon truth.
Yes.
Yeah.
And you came at it from a different perspective, I think, though.
Yeah, I mean, I think it always depends on how you phrase the question. Mm-hmm. But I do think that at least the average Trump voter would probably tell you that people who live in Sierra Leone have a lower IQ or have inferior physical fitness or like are in some way inherently inferior to a white American.
Yeah.
I'm pretty cynical about that after my country reelected the guy who described countries like Sierra Leone as shitholes.
Yeah. And dismantled USAID.
And threw parties about it and made jokes about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we've both heard the perspective that, yes, maybe the world's not perfect, but do we really think we can look to a place like Africa as a place, you know, where humanity will see its progress continued?
Right. Which to me, like, I mean, yeah, obviously, yeah, why not? Africa's huge.
Yeah. But it was this perspective that was just taken for granted that obviously, like, you know, the US or the Western world is the focal point of human civilization.
Right, which is like bonkers racist.
Right.
Yeah.
But so racist that it doesn't realize it is. It's so enveloped in its natural law of human history and the state of human affairs that it just doesn't understand itself as racist.
I don't think that any racism understands itself as racism. I think we're describing like peak racism right now.
Yeah, this capitalist perspective is able to creep itself in because it lends itself to these biases that we already have. And it confirms the biases in a way that makes it seem objective and scientific. You know, with these racist perspectives get legitimized by capitalism. And it's in the same way that the US gets kind of mythologized as the greatest nation on earth, the world's greatest democracy kind of thing, that we are the chosen ones. The book makes me think about how this capitalist perspective that is inherent to many people's way of thinking as natural and isn't even recognized as a perspective, is just recognized as the way of the world. We need to discard that and instead adopt a more arguably socialist, or at least, some perspective that sees people as equals and sees the relational value between people and not the market transaction of people.
In building up this capitalist mythology that the market will unearth the most good, that global capitalist competition will mean that those lives that flourish are the most valuable ones because the market is neutral and a moral arbiter. Obviously, that's evil, but it also misses the reality that our health outcomes are all interdependent, and that uplifting the health outcomes of the poorest people will uplift the health outcomes of everyone all over the world, because our health outcomes are intertwined. And the more global our society becomes, the more true that is. There will always be people in the richest countries in the world who cannot be vaccinated, who their health is compromised in some way such that a bacteria or virus that would not kill you or me would kill them. And if we minimize the amount of that bacteria or virus in the world, they will not be exposed to it.
And in fact, we've done that with other diseases.
We've done that with other diseases. We could do that with TB.
Yeah.
If we had the will to.
Yeah.
And so, even this idea that how many people a year die of TB?
1.23 million.
Jesus. That the 1.23 million people who are dying of a preventable and curable disease every year are sacrificed at the altar of progress, and that their deaths mean that the lives of people that TB doesn't touch are protected, is not true. That, in fact, eliminating TB in Sierra Leone means TB will not come to the US. And that investing in health outcomes anywhere is investing in health outcomes everywhere. Saving lives anywhere is saving lives everywhere.
Yeah.
One would think we would have learned that from COVID.
Yeah, but even with COVID, we saw, because of the way that capitalism promotes this very individualist perspective, where everything kind of starts from the individual and then slowly expands out from there. It's all about, well, I don't feel comfortable wearing a mask, or I don't feel comfortable getting this vaccine.
You can only imagine that as a choice that affects yourself and your own body.
Right.
Yeah.
And instead, seeing as the foundation the connections that you have to so many people, and the ways that your actions impact their lives and their actions impact your life. And understanding that is fundamental. No person is a world unto themselves. I mean, we do say all the time that every person is their own universe, but that's a completely different idea than any one person can survive on their own.
Yeah.
It's impossible. But yet, that is kind of the fundamental nature or the fundamental truth of capitalism, is that it is the individual that is the foundation, the foundational unit of the system, and everything expands from there. And so if the individual is not getting value, then therefore there is no value. If someone at an individual level believes, I don't care if someone else gets tuberculosis in another country that's an ocean away from me, then there is no value in it to that person.
There's no value in what?
If an individual person believes that tuberculosis is a disease that affects poor countries, and these countries are so far away from them that in their lifetime, they probably will never experience any major interaction with tuberculosis, then in that person's life, from the perspective of a capitalist, individualist perspective, there is no value in fighting tuberculosis.
Ah, okay, yes.
Yes. Versus a perspective that sees health and sees as a fundamental unit the relations between people, not the individual person, but the relations between people as the fundamental unit. No person is a single person. Everyone is connected. And therefore, there is going to be a value in uplifting and helping our neighbors, even an ocean apart.
Yeah. And that's like a pretty fundamental belief in every major religion, isn't it? I'm thinking of a quote from the Prophet right now. I believe it's from the chapter on buying and selling, actually, which is funny.
Yeah, but in a way, I think you could almost say that this capitalist perspective has tricked us into basing all our moral decisions and actions off of an individualist framework rather than a relational framework.
Yeah. Can I read it?
Yeah.
For the master spirit of the earth shall not sleep peacefully upon the wind till the needs of the least of you are satisfied.
Yeah.
Which is a very pretty version of another quote that I had brought up for us to close out on today from Miss Rachel.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. No child anywhere will have the brightest future possible until all children everywhere are taken care of and given everything they need to thrive.
And one of John Green's points is that the disease, tuberculosis, is where the drugs are not, which is basically to say that the drugs that will treat and cure tuberculosis inexplicably can't find their way to the people who need it most. And I think the quote unquote inexplicableness of it is capitalism. It's this enforced hierarchy of the world that sees these communities ravaged by tuberculosis as unimportant.
Yeah, and the specific iterations of that include things like drug companies that have the patents on the effective drugs keeping prices high artificially, lack of infrastructure so that people do not have access to health clinics, and distrust of medical providers and medical institutions of the people that they're serving, and vice versa. And also needing to have a lot of food when you're being treated for tuberculosis and not having access to food. Stigma, local stigma that marks people who are ill with tuberculosis as morally suspect. You know, all of these things are part of what you're referring to as the system that dictates that a life in Sierra Leone is less valuable than a life in the United States.
Yeah. Despite what, this conventional belief that no human is worth more than another. We can say that and believe that, and yet that's not the reality. That's not the belief that the world is reflecting. And by the world, I mean our human choices and structures that we've built.
Yeah, political reality has not been built based on that premise. It has been built on the premise that the greatest moral good is to generate the most value for shareholders.
Correct.
Yeah.
And what have we learned about loving each other?
Yeah, what have we learned about acting more loving in a society?
I think this is something I've been coming back to throughout this episode, and also just something that I've been thinking about for both a while now, kind of since I started doing my work with fat phobia and the medical treatment of obesity. A through line to this has been my science brain wants to think of these things as objective and apart from me, and they are. But they are also just as much, if not more, a product of what I think of them. In the sense that, if I think tuberculosis is important, then I will consider donating money to support efforts that will build the health infrastructures needed to get rid of the disease. If I don't think of tuberculosis as important because it doesn't really have a place in my day-to-day life, then despite tuberculosis existing out in the world, it will effectively not exist within my brain.
Yeah. And likewise, if you think that tuberculosis is important, you might more likely vigorously support political candidates who would invest in global health initiatives with much more resources than are available to you to donate to an organization like Partners in Health, and vigorously work to remove from political power politicians who would slash funding that save lives. from tuberculosis and other preventable diseases.
We're talking about tuberculosis here because that's the topic of the book. But really, I think this is a reflection on the state of health in our current global society.
Yeah. I grew up in a household with 2 sisters from Ethiopia. So health outcomes in the global south felt very close to home for me. It did not feel like separate, out of sight, out of mind. And it has always struck me as very obviously wrong and very obviously constructed. Very obviously the result of evil human choices and not reflective of an ethical hierarchy that makes any sense whatsoever.
That's fair.
Because I remember the shock when I came back from Ethiopia of going to a grocery store and seeing so much abundance in one place and almost being sickened by it. For a while after visiting that part of the world, seeing something like a hot dog eating contest seemed grotesque to me. I guess because my worldview is so rooted in poverty exists everywhere. And if you want to see poverty, you don't have to go to Africa. You don't have to go to Asia. You can look in your own backyard, right? And the corollary to that being that in countries in the global south that Americans might think of as developing or less advanced, less civilized, because they lack as much infrastructure, or we imagine them to lack as much infrastructure often. We flatten the people there as objects of tragedy or inspiration. And I really buck against that a lot. I think that people experience extreme deprivation and live in survival mode in quote unquote developed countries. And people flourish and thrive in quote unquote developing countries. And it is also so that the scale of poverty is meaningfully different. Qualitatively, the poverty is meaningfully different. If you live in a place where there are sidewalks or no sidewalks, if you live in a place where there are grocery stores full of food or there aren't, and if you live in a place where there is a reliable power grid or there isn't. And so I think like that nuance of the humanity is the same everywhere and the conditions are meaningfully different in different places, and holding both those truths at the same time in tension with each other is something that I could always do better at in my understanding of the world.
Yeah. Romanticization is just another form of stigmatization.
Yeah.
Pitying people in other countries because of a perceived lacking is, in effect,
objectification.
Yeah.
And I think like I have corrected so much in that direction because like literally my sisters are from Ethiopia, right? Like it feels very close, very normal to me that like obviously Africans are not separate and apart from me. But I think like at times I have overcorrected in that direction to say like, well, poverty in Africa is no different from poverty here. It is. It is.
Yeah. I think
this was a tricky one. We got real abstract. I had trouble keeping up with you.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. But thank you for suggesting that we do this book for the podcast-a-thon.
Yeah. And as I said up front, there'll be a link in the podcast show notes where you can contribute to Partners in Health, which is our chosen donation. Also, if you're listening to this 5 years from now and the podcast-a-thon has long since ended,
you can still donate to Partners in Health.
I'm sure Partners in Health will still be a thing.
Yeah.
I'm sure it wouldn't be difficult to find another charity that is doing similar work and trying to correct injustices that have been the result of human choices.
Human choices. I love you.
I love you too. I'm making the human choice to love you.
Yeah, let's have lunch.